Okay. So, Everett, just I think everybody else has been here, but what we've been talking as a group of how we should organize this. From what we're doing is some of the guys are joining as early as 6:45 just for like we would at the Moot House, just having coffee and talking. The teaching will start at 7, and I'm planning on going around 20 minutes or so at the most. Well, it might stretch to 30 occasionally, but we want to spend time in table time and discussion, either formally. I'm figuring out how to use the breakout room option, and we'll be doing that, I think, next week. Today's going to be pretty much content, and it's going to prepare us for next week. But then we're looking, we kind of voted, and we like the idea of going for an hour. So if anybody has to leave prior to that, feel free to just say, hey, I got to head out. We'll see you guys next week. But otherwise, we'll be planning on the hours between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning. So that's what we've come up with, Everett. So, I'm going to make sure I'm recording. Whoop. Jeez. What did I just? All right. So
change the view.
I think I just messed up the screen. Here we go. Now we're back. Can you guys see the screen? The slide?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So last week we talked about, we're looking at now the story of the woman at the well from a larger perspective. And within this story, there are three responses to Jesus. The first is, of course, and this is the main core of the story of the woman at the well, that interaction. And there's an exchange going on represented by the two arrows right here. And in the end, the woman in verse, I think, 28, she abandons her water pot to go tell others. In excitement over the good news, she leaves the well and goes back into town. The second group that we haven't really looked at in any detail yet are the men in the city that she goes and tells. And she says to them, come and see the man who told me all things about myself. Is this not the Christ? And somehow through her testimony, they drop what they're doing and they leave the city to move towards Jesus. The third response is quite different, and that's the disciples. These are the guys that were actually walking with him, the called ones. They've invested. They have, at a point in time, dropped what they were doing to follow Jesus, similar to the woman. But now they come onto this scene with Jesus, and they judge, and they try to correct. And so there's a hard line of distinction between what's above the line and what's below the line. There are two responses that are receptive, right here, receptive, and one is, in a sense, challenging or corrective. They're trying to correct Jesus. Jesus is not performing the way that the disciples think Jesus should be performing. He's transgressing social boundaries, and he is not taking care of himself. And so that's the feeling that we get in this story. So let's, could somebody read the story? Verses, our focus is verse 31 through 38, but for context, could we read beginning in verse 25 through 38? Could somebody do that?
The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman, Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" They went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one brought him anything to eat? Did he, no one brought him anything to eat, did he?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, 'There are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest'? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor."
All right, thank you, Bob. So I underlined white right here because I think Bill last week brought this up. I checked that, Bill, and it is in the New American Standard, it is white, white unto harvest. Yeah, you're muted. So what we're doing here, what we're doing over here today is we're setting up the background to really look at this whole section right here with that was the catalyst of this whole launch into food and grain and harvest and all of this. This teaching of Jesus to the disciples, and what occasioned that is they said, "Rabbi, you need something to eat." So rather than just diving into it, I think it would be really good to spend last week and this week on setting the background so that we will then look at verse 32 through 38 in the light of what I'm going to be laying out today. So that's the reasoning behind this whole thing. So let's move on. So I created this slide is just, again, kind of an overview. We're looking, we want to look at the whole story within the context of the bigger story of John. And so I created the what and the why of this story. And the first, under the what, Jesus is presenting a common message. This message has been the same all the way through now to chapter 4. And that message is to receive what I am saying. It's all about receptivity. And that's what he's calling people to. Some people are responding and some people are not responding. And we've got eyes in to see what this is all looking like. There's a polarized response. And I will use the term polarized and disparity as interchangeable. I like both terms. The word polarization is what we saw on the prior slide, where the polarization of the woman's response in concert with the men of the city, and polarized opposite to that is the response of the disciples as they enter into the scene. The resistance, well, there are two. That polarization is receptivity and resistance. And the resistance is being demonstrated by those who have been with him, by the disciples. So what we can gather by that is, I think we as human beings, we got this idea that once we, quote, accept Jesus, we get it. Well, I think in a sense, we do get it to some degree. But here are examples of people, the disciples, who have, quote, accepted Jesus. They've left their nets to follow him, and they're now having difficulty. And of course, then the question is, why is that disparity? Why is that polarization? So I think it's just fascinating question. On the other side, the why behind the story is this. First of all, John is providing insight. And again, this is from a bigger perspective of the gospel writer himself. And this is, of course, my opinion. John is providing insight into the nature of belief and how belief is fleshed out over time. How belief is fleshed out over time. And what we're seeing is not just a once catch-all and then once all, but it is a process over time, this process of belief. Therefore, we will examine the four facts that may explain the disciples' behavior within this story. That's what we're going to look at today, the four facts. We introduced it last week. And I'm not showing the slides prior to this one last week, but you know, our typical view of growth, if you guys can see me on the screen, is, you know, what I got to do it backwards here. We start here at the lower corner and then we, oh boy, then we move up like this. That's hard to do. Or here, I'll do it on the screen. Our typical view of growth is like this, where we start taking on, we accept Christ, we start taking on Christian knowledge, we start doing the Christian practices, and life should be kind of a linear growth off into whatever maturity looks like. Well, you know, all of us are far enough in our lives to know that that just is not the case. So I'm going to propose to you an alternate view, and not in opposition to the linear view, but actually this view is inclusive of that view. So let's take a look at the four facts here. Four facts regarding this model. Fact number one are, and I saw Tatsi, he's taking pictures. Tatsi, you're able to go to the website, Christ in the Rockies, to the homepage, right on the homepage will be posted this tomorrow. You'll be able to get all the slides if you want. So, I mean, it's up to you, but just so you're aware. Number one, people are able to understand. Let me back up. In my view, there are 7 stages of growth. And as this shows here, down here, it moves in this direction. And as we grow, it's not in a linear fashion, it's more in an inclusive action. And that's what we're going to see here. So fact number one is that you and I and all human beings are able to understand only one stage beyond their current stage of growth. I would put the disciples at growth stage number 2. Growth stage number 1 is about survival. It would be what we would call the lizard brain survival of humanity. I've got to have this in order to survive. That would be at the most fundamental level that we function as human beings. Number 2 has to do with relationships and realizing that we are part of something relational, but what the chief characteristics of level 2 is tribalism. The disciples are clearly entering into their discipleship relationship with Jesus through a tribal grid. We are Jews. We are following the intended Messiah. We are part of something. The woman is also in that same realm. Why are you of the tribe Jew speaking to me of the tribe of Samaria? And I would say most of our human culture is in areas 2 and 3. 2 and 3 is very much tribalism, and whether it is outside in the world of tribalism, political parties, and so forth, that defines who we are, and it can be tribalism within the church. I belong to Apollos, I belong to Paul. Guys, it just permeates our culture, and it's where our brains as a culture primarily are. And that's where we enter, these disciples enter their discipleship in a tribal mentality, level 2. And the reality is when, if I'm a level 2, I can somewhat see glimpses of level 3, but I have no idea what 4 through 7 look like. It is so far beyond me. I don't have any inkling of what that is like.
Mike, do you have any slides or on 2 and 3?
Yeah, I'm not going into that detail right now. We may move into that later. I don't know. All I'm showing you is that there's this model of 7 stages, but we're not going to be analyzing today the 7 stages. But what is true of all 7 stages are the 4 facts that I'm expressing this morning. And by grasping or by meditating on these 4 facts, we'll kind of get more of an understanding of what's going on with these disciples. So fact number 2 is what people don't understand, they naturally reject, ignore, or fight. So here I am. I'm at level 2, and I can kind of see into level 3, which has to do with more. Level 3 is moving into my identity in relation to the relational, into the bigger picture, and so we can kind of understand this. And I think this woman clearly states this, because she goes back to the men in the city, and she goes, I have met a man who has told me all things that I have done. Is this not the Christ? He's challenging through her interaction with Jesus. She is starting to see glimpses of the light of this level 3, of moving into. She has certainly had trouble in relationships, and so she's been able to just peer into level 3. Beyond that, what we tend to do as human beings is that we tend to fight, reject, and ignore what's out there. Case in point is how the disciples come onto the scene. Jesus is violating, in their minds, creating a social boo-boo here, and they reject it. And there's where I think that this comes into play. Number 3 is that fact number 3 is to move from one stage of growth to the next requires some sort of troubling, unknowing, or wounding, or I could say dying, which we identify as loss. And I think this is so critical. We do not grow exclusively by gaining more biblical knowledge. It is certainly helpful, but we grow through dying, through the letting go, through the troubling unknowing, through a wounding that must occur, and through a loss that must occur. When these things happen, it sets up the stage for something new to happen, something new to change. And that is the way, at least from my perspective, the way that growth happens. The grain of wheat that must fall into the ground and die in order to bear much fruit. And that's what we're going to see in the lives of the disciples. They are going to slowly die over time. And there's going to be a resurrection in the book of Acts when we see them come alive. And that's where the New Testament is going here. So there's fact number 4, or 3 rather, and then 4, one's current stage of growth is indicated by a forgiveness and inclusion, not an excuse, we're not excusing, but we're including an inclusion of the why behind. There's a forgiveness of the prior stages of growth. And this is so critical. This Jesus personifies this in his life, of this forgiveness and this inclusion that the religious leaders of his day just could not get by. They could not get beyond their predefined constructs, level of growth, tribalism, level 2. They just couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. Some did, Nicodemus did, but as a group, they just couldn't do it. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do. He's calling us this movement through these stages of growth, but at each stage involves a death. And we know that we have moved into that stage if we're able to forgive and to include, not excuse or not agree, but we can put it into a bigger context of what is being said. So I'd like to let me summarize, and then we're going to take some comments on this, so you can get ready to turn your mics on. People are able to understand only one stage of growth beyond their current stage. Number 2, what people don't understand, they naturally reject, ignore, or fight. Number 3, to move from one stage of growth to the next requires a troubling unknowing or a wounding, and I would even add a dying, which we identify as loss, this loss that must occur. And number 4, one's current stage is indicated by a forgiveness and an inclusion into the prior stages of growth. So I'll leave these on the screen. Comments, what do you guys think?
Well, I was thinking, you don't have to bring that last slide up, but you had the slide up where the bottom of the slide had the women and the men of the city, and the top of the slide had the disciples. And it seems that the top of the slide was a lot more resistant to what's going on here than the bottom of the slide. And I assume that, I'm going to make an assumption here, that the reason for that is the people at the bottom of the slide were hanging on to their identity a little more loosely than the people on the top of the slide were. So they were open to this. In other words, they may have had a northern Israel, or the northern tribe mentality here of just the Torah, but it's sort of like it didn't hold on to them as tight as the whole deeper historical history held on to the disciples. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and why I'm interested in throwing it out on the table is of why that is. I think it's
wait a minute though.
Yeah.
Wait a minute though. It may be something different than that, in the sense of the woman had her identity, you might say, and you could say she threw it away, but she didn't really, because what happened was she said, here's what the Torah says. And Jesus's response was basically, it's true, but you're not understanding it fully. And then she goes off to the men and basically said, the prophecy is true, right? The Messiah is here. And and so what you have isn't that she's throwing away necessarily, but that she's letting her
Right.
identity be informed by the truth. Whereas on the disciples' side, they're saying, no, our identity is first. The truth can come later.
Okay,
You know,
I can see
kind of
that. Yeah, I can see that, but I also think she's able to jump from Torah way forward into the new age, if you will, where the disciples have the Torah plus the prophets plus lots of stuff. And it seems like she's making a bigger jump, but almost a freer jump than the disciples. The disciples don't want to make that jump. I mean, they don't get it. And of course, the men in the city are in the same context that the woman is. They're in the context of the Torah. You're right, Mike. She doesn't throw the Torah away, but she was able to look at the Torah and look at Jesus and say, oh, okay, I got it, and jump to it. The disciples seem to have, I don't know how to phrase it, I'll call it more baggage, and I don't want to diminish their history, but they have the temple, the Jerusalem, the whole history behind them that seems to anchor them in the current mindset.
Yeah.
But
the whole thing there
mine is
the
kind
power
of
go
mine is
ahead.
simple. Okay, I think that the disciples are kind of still self-centered, and what happens is the other people on the bottom are become receptive because they become other-centered, and I
Why?
find myself that I actually, when I'm self-centered, I tend to judge and you know, set myself up in comparison to other people when I'm self-centered. Whereas these people here are receptive because they're other-centered and they're willing to accept Jesus as the Messiah.
I think these groups in the scripture here, as well as the rest of us, at least speaking for myself, are wrestling with what was encapsulated by Jim Elliot in the famous quote from him, who said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And I think that's what's being spoken to here. Things that are familiar, that we feel are known to us, things that we have grounded our actions and our thoughts in, and we grab to them so differently. But when Jesus and the Holy Spirit enter the scene, the whole set, the whole background, the whole world changes, and we have to shift gears to begin to realize that what we're keeping is nothing to give up what we can never lose. And I think that's what they're wrestling with here, and I think that's what we still wrestle with on a daily basis. At least I do.
Well, the key there, though, is that it didn't really change in that sense, because Christ's coming was prophesied. It's all part of the story.
But I
And
think,
so
oh, go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and the key here is that the difficulty and the baggage that the disciples are dealing with is deception. Okay, when you think something is true that isn't true, like for instance, the whole prophets thing that Bill brought up. Okay, now the prophets were true, some of them, not all of them, and there was deception that came in because people accepted things that weren't true, and so once you have that, then it becomes difficult to overcome, you know, getting through it, because that's when you run into a situation like Mike's talking about, where you have to have loss in order to move from deception to truth. You have to lose the deception.
Yeah,
and
The
move to
whole Samaritan society had been based on many deceptions because of the other cultures and so forth that they had absorbed and made part of their broader community.
Yeah.
So they're a prime example of laboring under misconceptions and untruths that the Lord had warned against. But you can go back in several Old Testament scriptures and find reasons for the Samaritans being in the thought process that they are.
Yeah. Now the key is for the women and for the men in that one is it the truth that informs our reality, or does our reality inform our truth?
Right.
And that's the question that comes down, and really it's a question of faith.
Yeah, my point is, I think they were more self-questioning than the disciples. And I have to go to Mike's point number 3, back to what you said, Michael, is that they had a sense of wounding. or something, whatever one of those features Mike says is necessary to be open to the next level. They had that, maybe it's a question. What was their sense? What was it that they held on to this more loosely than the disciples did? I don't mean they rejected, but that number 3, I think, was real more true of them at this point, at least in the story.
So if I can just say, and I'll let you guys, I'm maybe monopolizing a little bit, but so my perspective on this thing overall is not necessarily on the 4 facts. And I think it's true if we assume that our position informs our reality rather than reality informing our position. So if one says, I'm going to have the truth lead me rather than I'm going to lead the truth, then this model is not necessarily true, that you have to have loss in order to grow. But anyway, so that's my perspective on it. Go ahead.
I sort of look at the model and wonder with the disciples here, in a sense, and I don't know, Mike, what the next 3 stages are, but I look at the model and think the disciples maybe went through this when they encountered Jesus, and there was a loss that they must have experienced to sort of forsake all and follow him.
True.
And I sort of see the model as maybe cyclical for us. So having experienced that loss, they were sort of, would you say, loath to go through another loss here.
Right.
And I agree, I guess, with Bill that the Samaritan situation, they were sort of prepped to somehow move into this cycle of change, whereas the disciples were not sort of ready to move into another one at this point. But God keeps moving us through this, I think, time and again in our lives.
Yeah, I agree. This is very cyclical, and at least in the model that I tend to adopt is at least 7 cycles. There could be many, many more, but every time we move into a higher, more, just a deeper stage of growth is a loss. That cyclical. It has to die. Something has to die. And as we look at the disciples now, they are early on in their discipleship process. And the disciples we see now in this juncture where they're criticizing Jesus for talking to a Samaritan woman is quite a different disciple than when we see Peter getting up on the day of Pentecost and saying, "Men of Galilee, listen to me." You know, I mean, and he was still in his discipleship at that point. We see him arguing with Paul over issues later on, and you know, it's a continual journey and a process. And what is indicative, and at least from my perspective, and required, necessary, is a dying to move to another stage, a loss. And so anyway. Kind of got you thinking this morning, huh?
Well, I think society works that way. And right now, and these are broad strokes, so there's exceptions. But back in 9/11, right now, coronavirus, people tend to be more open to thinking, and it might be towards Jesus and scriptures, might towards something else. But they all of a sudden they open their minds up a little more because their current world is not as stable as they thought it was. And these are times like that. It's interesting. And
what we're reading here today is exactly what we are experiencing right now at a global, unprecedented level. there is a dying, I mean, and I'm not saying this cutesy or punly, and grief for the loss of true lives, but there is we are not even at the retooling. I've used the term deconstruction. We are going through a massive global deconstruction. Who would think a month ago the Moot Men would be meeting via, somebody's got their microphone on in the background, the Moot Men would be meeting virtually like this, and not only just electively, but mandatorily, that we have to now meet like this. It would, that was so far off our radar. And that's how these things occur. And to the degree that we can embrace what is happening, rather than fight what is happening, embrace and acknowledge, those are the avenues to growth versus, just sitting around and being depressed that I can't go down to Austin's and have lunch anymore. there are bigger issues going on. So
this kind of goes back to the graph though that we had last time. And there's the scripture, the truth will set you free. Jesus says that you may know the truth, for the truth will set you free. And so the kind of thing that we're talking about here happens. Let me break out my annotation pen. Do you mind if I just draw it on the screen? It won't.
No, what slide do you want, Mike?
Well, it was the slide from last time that has that graph. It's your growth graph, remember? And you guys had this like that.
Yep.
I don't know if you want to jump presentations, but
yeah, I can do that. Let me see if I can.
Get my thing off of there.
We're living on the edge here, Mike.
All right. Push it a little.
Do you want this one?
Yeah, this guy. This will work fine. Okay.
All right.
So basically, the model that you have is one that's true if, for instance, I say, okay, the top line is here. Okay. And I don't care what truth there is. This is the top line. And that's when I get into bondage, because then somebody says, wait a minute, I'm up here. And then in order for me to get from here, and I'm trying to work my way to that top line, to here, this thing has to die, right? And so you have your model, like you were saying. But if we set our truth at the true truth, and this is God, right? He's up here. Then we don't necessarily have that problem. I mean, we still have to grow. It's like when you think about Jesus as the ultimate revelation of God, okay? He was a baby once. And when he was a baby, he had all the limitations that a baby has, and he grew, it says he grew in strength and stature and whatnot. And so he's growing, but because there's no falseness in him, there's no false ceiling, nothing in him ever has to die for his own sake. The only time that death enters into Jesus's life is when he's dying for our sake. And then he's, something that does have to die there. One, it's our false conceptions that are being killed, basically, and Christ is dying to pay the consequences for those false conceptions that we have. And so this may be a thing that's, a different stage or whatever, but if we think about that, and it's when we understand that kind of thing that the big picture starts to come into focus, where you start to see, okay, in the Old Testament, these things happened. This is truth. Okay. It is true. What God told the Jews was true. Okay. They didn't understand because it was like a tutor. It says that in Romans and whatnot throughout the New Testament, that situation was an instructor to teach them. And the teacher is teaching them step by step, right? Step by step. but always pointing and saying, look, here's the ultimate destination up here. You know, the prophecy of Christ coming we have with Moses. So no sooner did Israel become a nation than they had the prophecy that Christ would come, the Messiah would come, in their lap. And the question is does their life, you know, do they say, okay, we have this truth and the truth will inform our life, or is our current situation, whatever it is, the food we have, the water we have, whatever, that reality going to inform my truth? And there are cases of people, obviously, that went either way. So that shows that one can, you know, that's one of the things that's valuable about the Old Testament, is it shows you what can happen. So there's a deception out there that we don't have a choice, for instance, and the Old Testament shows you have a choice, because there are always cases of people who decide to walk with God, and there are always cases of people that decide not to. But it's clear in the Old Testament that God is holding those people accountable for their own decisions. And that leads into, like, the discussion we had about the Samaritans. They were, you know, a result of people mixing, essentially, with the society around them and pulling those kind of things in. And the woman and the men are both in an unpleasant situation because of that lack of following, so to speak, where they said, you know, there's some other, let me clear this stuff off of here. You know, there was some other nation or something that set the bar over here, and they're down here. So they say, hey, cool, I'm going to go that way, like that. Or maybe they're even up here, and somehow they get deceived into thinking that's better. But anyway, so you have that sort of thing, which has natural consequences. But then at any point, the question is do we accept, you know, God's instructions to us and what him as truth, so that we can refocus, and basically then you get that, you know, the similar type of line that you'd get, because, you know, whatever happens in your life and you get refocused, and then you can lose focus for various reasons. But at the same time, if God is your example, if he's your truth, and you're letting him inform your life versus otherwise, then the losses aren't the same. Then you get into the situation like Paul says, where, you know, he counts all these things but dung or whatever, that he lost, so to speak. Although to him, he's basically saying it's really not a loss. So you don't get into, he's definitely not in that situation where he's afraid of the next loss he has to take, because he knows the goal is here. So if this thing or this thing or this thing gets lost, it doesn't matter. And anyway, did I make my point?
So, well, does anybody have any comments on Mike's comments?
Yeah, to overlay what you were saying before, the one slide was, you know, how did everybody, what is our response to Jesus, right? And so we had the disciples and the men in the city and the woman. So they all were going through life. They all, from this slide, were building a life. Life goes on. We've all had our world rocked by the big picture at the moment. Everett has really had his world set upside down.
Right.
And, you know, the woman in the story, and probably everybody, they were looking, it says they were looking for the Messiah, right? And to overlay what Mike's saying, Jesus said he was the truth. So what did people, why did the people leave the city to come hear Jesus or see Jesus or meet Jesus? And how in the world did that transform their lives? how did the woman have her life transformed? And the disciples, this story is just a picture in time. So they probably started like the men and the woman. There was a time where the disciples responded to a real need, and they, so our journey is much like theirs, and life has gone along, and all of a sudden Jesus shows up, and it is very, very different than what we thought. And the question is now, what do we do with this Jesus? So I see the personal inner reactions to this, Mike, and the impact is the growth. But it all comes out of this personal encounter, and they're all at different stages. The context of their lives are different places, but their world is shook. And the question is, what are they holding on to? And basically, Jesus just leaves them with himself.
Okay, good.
It's common that as Jesus comes, the people that are most receptive to him, in a way, are the ones that have little to lose. I mean, he comes to the outcasts, go to the Sermon on the Mount, or dinner with sinners, or coming to the prostitutes. And these people, they're so much more receptive to him. Because I think that the system that they're living under right now wasn't that attractive to them. They were judged, they were cast out, they were thrown down. And they're pretty happy to say, I'm happy to find a better way. But I want to comment on something that troubles me. And Mike read, and did Jesus have to go through step 3 here? And the thing that bothers me is that one verse that pops up in Hebrews where it says that, I got it right here. It says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once being made perfect, became the source of salvation. So it's not that Jesus was untrue or a liar or anything, but he seemed to have to go through something in this mortal body that was necessary for him to grow. That's just the implication of the verse. And I thought that's intriguing. I don't know what to do with it, but it's sort of intriguing that he said he learned obedience through suffering. Without the suffering, was something he wouldn't have learned. And I thought that was interesting. Yeah. And the reference to that is Hebrews 4, verse 8. No, Hebrews 5, verse 8. But I think you're familiar with it. It's just an interesting comment.
That's another tickler to this thing that we've talked about before, this incredible, wonderful, beautiful mystery of this God-man, and trying to wrap our understanding around how he could have been fully both. And that verse speaks, directly to that. And I don't have any ta-das. It's just that, yep, there we are again, trying to wrestle with.
Yeah.
So yeah, the big thing is, we're in Lent, and our world is so upside down. This Sunday's Palm Sunday. I don't know about you. Sometimes like to look and see where Jesus was and what he was doing. But Bill, just from what you said, the whole Isaiah 53 piece, this idea of the suffering servant, why did Jesus have to suffer? Why couldn't he just come and die and show us life and move on? What is it with the suffering?
I think the answer to that is because of us. So the key thing is yeah, for me personally, and this kind of goes into, so I'm not saying Mike Hadorf that your models, in fact, I agree with it in a certain context. Okay, now the key thing is if we start at the beginning and we say, okay, it's just a matter of survival. What do I need to live? Who cares about everybody else? Okay. And if I'm in that situation and I have my sights set on God, okay, that's one thing. But now comes the question of, okay, am I really by myself? And the answer is no. There's people all around me. Okay. And so you kind of make that realization. Now, the people around you have an effect. So in Christ's case, the suffering that he goes through, and it's really tremendous amount, because he knows the truth, rock solid, like way more than we will ever, well, until we're in heaven, then we'll know like he knows. But the key is that he knows, and he's walking the perfect path through this world of people who are off the rails, so to speak. And all the things around you, like this current situation is a good example. Okay. Do I believe that the coronavirus is a big thing to worry about? The answer is no, I don't. And the reason I don't is because I know that God is in control of these things. So if the coronavirus is going to take me, great, whatever, fine, I don't care. So do I let that limit my life? Well, do I have a choice? Right? In Colorado, they've said we've mandated now. So if you're caught abusing the limitations they're imposing on you, there are consequences. So the people around me, and there must be some percentage of them that think that this is a real thing you really have to worry about, and that the reaction that's being taken is the correct action. Because of that, it affects me. And there are, there's a certain suffering that I go through. And really the interesting thing about it is the sufferings come as a result of love. So in Christ's case, because he loved us, it truly hurts, so to speak, for him to see people that are off the path. And there's a certain amount of, that's basically all it is. And like for me personally, it's the same thing. When I look at what's going on in America, it hurts me to think how this misunderstanding of what really matters is affecting people and affecting our way of living, our form of government. All of this stuff is being affected by the fact that people have missed the big picture. They set the bar here instead of here. And so now they're saying, well, we can't lose. This is so important. Whatever this is, we can't lose it. And therefore we're going to go way off doing all sorts of drastic things to solve this little problem, when in reality, it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in the sense, like Mike was saying, it's unfortunate when people die, but it's not the key. The key is do we walk with God or not? And then let God take care of, the rest of it, so to speak. We do our part. So it's kind of funny because it's one of those things where it loops back from, hey, I'm by myself. What am I going to do? And then wait a minute, but what about the people around me? And then you have to go back to, okay, I don't have control over all the people around me. So I have to go back to controlling myself, because that's what I have control over. And am I walking with God or not? And what are the consequences and so on? And how do I know? And all that. Anyway.
Well, thank you guys. It's 7:59. We're going to have to break for commercial break here. So thank you for coming. This morning we looked at 4 facts that at least inform my thinking of some explanation of how these men like you and I could at the very beginning of their discipleship give up a great deal, leave their nets and follow Christ, but yet enter in the scene now in chapter 4 at so conversely of what we're seeing as the thrust of the story. And how do we explain their disparity, their very small thinking in light of what is going on in the big picture, their tribalistic type of thinking, their projection of their own needs onto Jesus? How do we explain it? Well, I just look within, and I can certainly have some insight why that is. So I've attempted to give you, at least from my perspective, a grid, a way of thinking about this story and about what is happening, the disparity, the polarization. Next week, we're going to go into verses, I think it's 32 through 38, where Jesus launches out into this teaching about the harvest. And we're going to look at that in light of what we've looked at thus far. So, guys, it is 8:01. Have a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining in.
Amen.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Have a good week, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Oops.